So step one, the basics. Let me read the poem, and maybe it's been a little while since you looked at it, but I'm going to read it. Plus poetry has that musical quality that we want to hear. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to do step one. Then I'll read it again, and I'll do step three. Then I'll read it a third time and do step two. Then I'll read it a third time and do step three. So this is going to take a little while. I understand that, I'm trying to really do it from its complete quality. So if you want to go back and watch this later, I'm going to have it available for you as you're working on your homework one. But it does take me a while to go through all the stages when I'm explaining everything, but hopefully it will help you. So the poem is Ode to a Texas Porch by Esteban Rodriguez. Rain-starved, sun-warped, porous and unsteady. You moan when the wind proselytizes hints of another season, spring, winter, front yard barbecues, holidays ripe with decorations. Potted plants line your splintered edges. Rusted nails peek from your rotted crevices. And yet, despite your crooked columns, your sunken steps, the whole of you refusing to believe in gravity's tenets, you're an altar for my father's work boots, for my mother's huaraches, for Sunday morning shadows armed with Spanish verses, pamphlets. Evenings, I claim your corners, sit and gaze at the darkness you breathe, feel it graze the ashen bottoms of my feet. And as it seeps across the yard, burrows beneath patches of parched Bermuda grass, a pack of strays, scarred with mange, haloed with fleas, begin squeezing between your fractured cinder blocks, the way I squeeze when a ball wanders off and I must squirm after it, crawl into a space filled with broken pipes, shattered glass, toy trucks and mangled plastic bags, and if deep enough, matted hide and bones, as though these creatures knew when they knew the earth would offer no other place to go. All right, so step one is going to be title, right? I know that an ode is speaking like a praise. So in this case, he's praising a porch with emotion. And I already said that when I think about a porch, I don't think about praising a porch. Good porch, good job, porch. So that's weird. But I'm going to keep it in my mind because there's got to be something to that. Why would you call it an ode if there wasn't some sort of praise involved in the treatment of the porch in the poem? And it might help me get to the meaning of it. Another thing I want to do is I want to look up words that I don't know. You have to do it. I know you don't like to do it, but just think about this. At least you have the internet. Think about your poor parents who had to use dictionaries, right? Like go to the shelf and get the dictionary. So I don't know what words you might need to look up here. I'm going to guess at a few and I'll be your dictionary today, but probably you already looked these up when you were working with the poem last week. Porous, proselytizes, maybe tenants, maybe huaraches. If you didn't know Spanish, you might have to look that up, right? Pamphlets, parched, Bermuda grass. I know what grass is, but I don't know what they mean by Bermuda grass. I might have to look that up. Mange, matted. I might know that or I might not. So now I'm going to look up all those words. It's just one of those necessities. We'll just go ahead and put them in because I will define them for you. Porous, of course, that's a science word. It means with holes. So that's where they're describing the sort of like the wood that's used to create the porch. It's porous. And proselytizes means like sort of like predicts in a religious way. Like portend. That's another thesaurus word to describe a thesaurus word, doesn't help us. But here the wind is sort of predicting another season. Well, you can kind of tell when the seasons are shifting. I just said a little while ago, well, it was really foggy out yesterday and today, and that is sort of like a season changer around here. So it's sort of like the weather giving you a hint at the future. Can you see how every time I do a vocabulary word, I'm kind of trying to relate it to the sentence that it's in? I'm trying to settle in my understanding of how that word's being used. Tenets, a tenet is like a rule. So here is a refusing to believe in gravity's tenets. So the rules, somebody is going against the rules of gravity or not believing in them. Huaraches are like sandals. Pamphlets are like folded info leaflets, right? Parched means thirsty. It's sort of like beyond thirsty, like parched is the next level thirsty. And then Bermuda grass is a certain kind of grass that grows mainly in like hot climates. If we tried to grow grass that grows in Minnesota here in South Texas, it would never make it. It would just come up out of the ground and go and like collapse back down onto the dirt. But especially if it had to stay up for, I don't know, like 6 months, like our summers here. So there's specially developed grass that's for the South. Well, we're in Texas, right? The title told us that. So that makes sense. Okay. Mange. Mange is like a scabby skin disease that we see in animals. Gross. What else did I highlight? Matted. Matted is like tangled. So much, it's so tangled that it formed a mass. Like if you ever had to comb your dog or your cat and there's a part of their hair that something got in it or they laid on it a certain way and it just all sort of interwove, that's matted. So tangled to form a mass. Here the description says, this is when he's under the porch. If deep enough, matted hide and bones. So this is like the remains of a creature underneath the porch there. So I'm not just defining, I'm taking those definitions and trying to like associate them with the description that's happening in the sentences and in the lines. All right. Another thing that I want to do when I'm in stage 1 is I want to think about the point of view. So the point of view in this poem, the speaker, I know is a first person speaker. How do I know that? Anybody?
He uses words like my and stuff.
Yeah, there's down here we have my father's, right? My mother's. Also you. So it's a first person speaker, but they're speaking to a porch. Okay, it's not normal. There's a term for that in literature analysis, and that's called apostrophe. It's totally different than the little, punctuation mark. So apostrophe is when somebody, some speaker in a poem or some narrator is speaking to something that can't answer back because it's an element of nature or, like a thing, not another person. So if a speaker is addressing the sky or the sun, or in this case, a porch, the porch is not going to answer back. So we call that apostrophe. That's just a little side note there. For those of you who we'll see examples of that on your poetry test and maybe go with it, right? So when I think about the speaker, I can see that he's speaking, he's speaking to the porch because of you, right? Now for now, I just want to notice that. I like to draw lines to things. It helps me visually connect things, but like when you're working on yours, you can do it whatever way makes sense to you. You don't have to do the way that you write it on the paper or make your notes is up to you. The 1, 2, 3 steps I want to see though. All right, another thing I want to look at this stage is any kind of like basic structure. So I know people struggled with structure a little bit when we were doing our assignment last week, and that's normal. It's a school, we're all learning, it's okay. But when we're talking about structure, we're looking at sentences, we're looking at paragraphs, we're looking at stanzas and lines. And when you get a poem like this that's all one big stanza and not broken up into sections that are handy, at the level 1 point, one thing that you can do is you can look at sentences, right? And you can look for structure by saying, okay, let me see where the sentences begin and end. Because in this poem especially, it's pretty interesting. What is this thing up here? Oh, go away. It will go away on its own, right? So if I look at the sentence length, everywhere where there's a period, I'm just going to put a little hash mark right here. Because there's 2 sentences, sort of, right here in the first line. That's really, really short sentences. Oh, do this later. Why are you bothering me? I'm doing 1, 2, 3 poetry analysis. I don't want to upgrade now. Go away. I'm just going to cover it up. Okay. The next sentence ends on the next line. So the next sentence is 1 line long. Then the next one ends here with decorations, edges, crevices. So these are all pretty short sentences. There's one longer one in here, but wait until you see what happens at the end of the poem that you didn't notice before. And yet, despite down here, pamphlets. Okay, do you see how that just got longer? This is from here to here is a much longer sentence than these little ones that were up here. And then where does the next sentence end? Here. So just on a basic level, I can see that the structure of this poem is such that the beginning has short little sentences, and then it gives way to longer sort of sweeping explanations and descriptions of the scene. So just on a basic level, I could say that the poem is structured in that way, with short sentences followed by longer and longer sentences until, I mean, like half the poem right here is 1 sentence from beginning to end down there. What does that have to do with what the poem means? I don't know yet, but I'm just exploring all of the things that are happening in the poem so that anything that comes up as I'm trying to figure out the meaning will be obvious to me. Now, before I move on to phase 2, I want to think about some topics. Usually I just sort of list them over here on the side, but if you want to mark them where they are, then you can do that too. This thing is supposed to be on don't bother me mode. Computers. Well, obviously we could say literally the poem is about a porch. I don't know if you could say much philosophically about the human experience through saying that it's about a concrete thing like a porch. Usually we want to get to something abstract. So let's just start with it's about a porch. It's about a porch, but it's also about the speaker's interaction with the porch, which it seems like he likes the porch, right? It seems like he is praising the porch. There's a description of his interaction with it, especially in the second half of the poem in this long sentence. He talks about how he gets up under the porch because he has to go and get a ball that's gone under there, and there's dogs that are under there. So in a way, it's almost like, I don't know, sort of like a darkness. Up here, though, it's all about the sun. So maybe there's like a weird dark light thing happening in this poem a little bit. Right now, it's just my first reading. So really, this is sort of speculation. I'm just putting my ideas down to see where they connect up later on step 2. Last thing I can do is look for a shift. And I did find one. Sometimes the shift will be obvious because the poet will like make a break and they'll be like stanza 1, stanza 2. Well, pretty obviously there's a shift between stanza 1 and stanza 2. But sometimes it's not as obvious. Like right here, there is a shift, right? There's a shift in the sentence because here's the end of that first longer sentence, and here's the beginning of that really long sentence that ends the poem. So there's a shift. I want to make a note. I usually like to draw a line across wherever I see a shift. There can be more than one shift in a poem. In this case, I really only see one. I want to say that the shift has to do with the sentences, right? He's kind of giving us a hint, this poet, that there's a shift here because there's all these multiple sentences up here and then this change for one big sentence at the bottom. So the sentence structure shifts completely at that stage. But also what's shifting is the time of day, right? Up here we have the sun warped aspects, the rotting, porch, the description of what's on the porch, and then all of a sudden we shift to evening. So we could also say that it shifts from probably daytime. I mean, people are coming to visit with their pamphlets and stuff, to evening. Do I know if that's going to be significant later? No, I don't, but I'm noticing that. So I want to write down whatever I notice so that it can feed into maybe a better understanding of the poem in stage 2. All right. So hopefully that gives you a little more background on structure and also how to do step 1. I'll put this paper up on the Google Classroom when we're done. Well, there's going to be more than one paper. All right, let's move on to step 2. Remember that the second reading of the poem, I've already figured some of this stuff out. I don't know how it works yet, but I want to read it a second time and I want to think about the figurative level. Okay, so why spend all your time writing about a porch, and especially a poem of praise? What's so great about a porch? And I want to start looking into that because that figurative element isn't obvious to me in my first reading of the poem. So I want to start thinking about the symbols and the metaphors and the effects of those things on the poem. So I'm going to label this one. I have a different pen that I wanted to use. This is the second reading of the poem. Now, when you're doing your paper, you can just put it all on one paper. I just think that when I'm making the notes, it gets harder and harder to read it with all my little scribbles and lines and stuff. So I'm just starting with a fresh one here. So I'm going to read it again, thinking, okay, I figured out a few things about this poem. I just need to go a little deeper. Ode to a Texas Porch. Rain-starved, sun-warped, porous and unsteady. You moan when the wind proselytizes hints of another season, spring, winter, front yard barbecues, holidays ripe with decorations. Potted plants line your splintered edges. Rusted nails peek from your rotted crevices. And yet, despite your crooked columns, your sunken steps, the whole of you refusing to believe in gravity's tenets, you're an altar for my father's work boots, for my mother's huaraches, for Sunday morning shadows armed with Spanish verses, pamphlets. Evenings, I claim your corners, sit and gaze at the darkness you breathe, feel it graze the ashen bottoms of my feet, and as it seeps across the yard, burrows beneath patches of parched Bermuda grass, a pack of strays, scarred with mange, haloed with fleas, begins squeezing between your fractured cinder blocks, the way I squeeze when a ball wanders off and I must squirm after it, crawl into a space filled with broken pipes, shattered glass, toy trucks, and mangled plastic bags, and if, deep enough, matted hide and bones, as though these creatures knew when they knew the earth would offer no other place to go. All right, so now I start thinking about the figurative aspects of the poem. I'm going to start thinking about the metaphors. I think there are a couple of metaphors in this poem, but the strongest and most common element that's figurative here, well, there's two of them. There's personification, aplenty, right? Like starved, what else? Moan, the porch is moaning, the wind is proselytizing, refusing is a human quality, belief is a human quality that's being associated with the porch. What else? Breathing. So there's a lot of personification. I want to start thinking about the words that are being used to personify the porch. And in one place, it's not the porch, it's the wind right here. So I want to start thinking about the ones that are being used and sort of like the qualities of those words. I want you to steer away from it's a positive or negative. That's a starting point, but that's not an ending point. But if I look at the words starved, moan, refusing, believe, and breathe, that sounds pretty like the basic human functions, well, except refusing. Starving, like eating, moaning, breathing, a lot of that is sort of like the basic functions of humans, right? Just gonna make a note about that. Belief. I'm also noticing that the imagery pretty much the personification pretty much stops right here. After that, imagery is the main feature of the second half of the poem. So let's make some notes about that. And then we'll talk about the metaphors. So the first imagery that we have right here is the imagery of the porch and its like visual elements. It's rain-starved, sun-warped, porous and unsteady. It's like old and unsafe. I mean, a porch that's unsteady is not going to be solid underneath your feet. There's a description also of the wind moaning, but then there's a description of the seasons and the rusted nails. Oh, there's another personification peak. So there's this description, all this imagery right here is describing sort of like the porch, the physical qualities of the porch. It's like usual porch stuff. Okay, there's nails poking out and it's splintered and, you know, the steps are sunken, all of that. So like normal porch things. Down here too, the things that are on the porch, father's boots, mother's sandals, people that are bringing, you know, leaflets on a Sunday. These are all being described here, and those are all normal things for a porch. That's the same stuff there. Usual things that we see on a porch. But then, right about the time when we said that there was a shift in this poem, for other reasons, right here, I'm noticing that there's a shift also in the imagery, because in the imagery now, we're taking the imagery from describing the porch to describing the speaker, right? I claim your corners, sit and gaze into the darkness you breathe. You can picture the little boy sitting, looking under into the porch. So the imagery here also shifts at that same point. This is how you know that you're on a good track with your interpretation. If multiple things are piling up to point in a direction, then you know that you're on the right track. So if over here, when I looked at, where's my first page? When I looked at this one, I already noticed this shift, and you know, okay, on a first reading that makes sense, but when it's emphasized with another element, a third element indicating that this is a shift, then I have to listen to that. And now I have to keep asking myself, what's different about the top part of this poem than is about the bottom part of this poem? And that might lead me to meaning too. So in this case, the imagery describes the speaker. So the shift there from porch to speaker, right? And it's all about, the second part is all about, also this is, remember where that whole big sentence is, it's one big sentence in the ending part right here. And it's all about how he is looking underneath there, how the shadows are seeping underneath the porch and the grass is changing. And then a whole bunch of dogs, a pack of strays, they have mange and they are haloed with fleas. That is a really cool image, because usually the dogs that have mange that are scarred and sitting like with their ribs hanging out underneath a house in the heat are usually not the most friendly or pleasant dogs, right? But here their fleas are a halo. That's a real oxymoron in a way, because a halo is supposed to be something beautiful and you know, saintly, but it's made up of fleas. So there's a real dichotomy there between that. So this, you know, that's almost, I want to say that that's like looking at connotation, that word haloed. There's a connotative element there. Right? There's the idea that the dogs are holy in some way. I mean, who wears a halo? But then the halo's made of fleas, so that's kind of a real opposition there. I don't know. It's an interesting word choice there. It could have just said surrounded, right? Or covered with fleas. Haloed. All right, so we continue with the imagery of the speaker who is getting underneath the porch, right? He's comparing the way, oh, I'll get to the metaphors in a minute, but he's talking about how he has to sometimes squeeze under there to get a ball because he's playing in the yard or whatever. And all the things that are in that space. He crawls into the space filled with broken pipes, shattered glass, toy trucks, mangled plastic bags. Mangled's another interesting connotative word, right? Shattered. The things underneath there are broken, like messed up, like useless. But also among them are the dogs that are haloed. All right. I was on imagery and I switched over to connotation. I get excited about poetry. All right, so here we have more imagery. This is describing the area underneath the porch. These creatures refers to the dogs. Well, dogs do go under the porch if they can to get out of the heat, or wherever they can, you know, like whatever shade from a tree or what have you, to if they've been out all day, you know, in the Texas heat. People even do that, right? They walk on the side of the street that's got the shadow more instead of the one that's in the sun. We do all those little tricks. All right, before I finish with step 2, I want to notice that there are 2 main metaphors in this poem. The first one is in the first part where he's still talking to the porch, and he says, "You're an altar for my father's work boots, for my mother's huaraches, for Sunday morning shadows armed with Spanish verses and pamphlets. So this is a metaphor. It's comparing the porch to an altar. So usually whenever I'm talking about or making notes on a metaphor, what I try to do is I will mark it metaphor, and then I will put like an equation, and I'll say, okay, well, the porch equals an altar. That's another weird thing to compare a porch to, because a porch is the normal, like, everyday thing, and an altar is something special and religious, right? It's kind of like a halo on a dog. And they're both religious things, right? So, oh, look at that. I can say, okay, down here I have the halo. There's a religious association there with this porch. It's almost like he's elevating the porch, taking it from its humble status as the thing that you walk on to get into the house and elevating it into something almost religious. So the function of this metaphor, elevation. We've all seen these dilapidated porches. We've walked on them, we've stepped on them, we've stood on them, we've left our shoes on them, right? We don't think about them as altars, but the poet here does. So there's got to be something special about this porch. There's something special about the dogs that are around it, even though they look really, like normal yard dogs. There's another metaphor a little bit later on having to do with the dogs. Here on line 25, a pack of strays scarred with mange, haloed with fleas, begins squeezing between your fractured cinder blocks the way I squeeze when a ball wanders off and I must squirm after it. So what's being compared there? It's another metaphor. Anybody? What's being compared in that metaphor?
Is it the dog and the person? The way
Yeah.
they squeeze?
Uh-huh. The dogs are equal to the speaker. They squeeze through because it's so hot out. They're just trying to get some relief into the shade, the same way he squeezes in when he goes looking after his toy. It rolled underneath there. He's got to go get it. He's little probably in this memory, so little kids can get into places. And it leads into this description of what it's like underneath the porch. So they both crawl. I'll make a little note here. They both crawl into the porch like to get something. The dogs are getting relief from the blazing sun and the heat, and the speaker is getting his toy, his ball that went under there. All right, so I already mentioned that. I just forgot to make a note about the damaged things that are under there. Okay, so the figurative part of it has brought me a little closer to understanding structure, because I realized that there's a lot more personification at the beginning of the poem than there is at the end. And also that the metaphors started to make me think about, and the connotation that's used here, this is actually a metaphor now that I think about it, because the dogs are being compared to angels, right? That's what we call an indirect metaphor. Because they have halos, they're being compared to angels. So I'm definitely noticing on the second reading that there is like a not a conflict, but a dichotomy is the word, but it's sort of like a balance between the ordinary and the holy. I know that that's a good interpretation because I can see it in multiple places. if I just come up with something and it's only in one place and it doesn't take into consideration the rest of the poem, then it's a shaky interpretation. But if I can see that that idea of the ordinary, like the porch, how it's falling down and it's unsteady and all that stuff from the weather, if I can see how that is balanced with things that are holy or special or, you know, in some way elevated, then I can see that a couple different places, right? And that helps me to understand that my interpretation might be going in a good direction. All right, so let me wrap this up. The third thing I want to do is get to meaning. I'm not going to read the poem again, but you would if you were going to. So meaning. All right, what are some topics in this poem? I had that before. Where's my list of topics? I put that on my first reading over here. Porch. Well, I think it's about a porch, but I think it's about more than a porch. So I don't want to try to say the whole poem is about a porch literally, because it's probably not. Praise. Well, we know that from odes, so that's a possibility, right? He is praising the porch. What else? What's another topic that we see in this poem? Anybody? Are you bored to death? I told you it would be long, but I feel like the more I do with it, the easier it will be for you when you're doing your new poem. Any other topics?
Would comfort be one?
Comfort, for sure. Because we were talking about how the dogs go up under the porch. He goes up under the porch to get something, right? Yeah, comfort. They're sheltered there underneath the porch. And they didn't have any other place to go, so they're being protected, right? It makes me think of refugees almost. Maybe it'd be too far to make that assumption with the porch, but in a really, really metaphor situation, it's almost like the porch is run down, but it's still protecting others, right? Like it's a refuge for others, refuge, a place of comfort, protection. Even though, see, now I'm getting away from topics and I'm starting to already come up with an idea, right? Hello. Okay. Even though it's like imperfect. The porch is falling down and porous and splintered and common. So I could ask myself, what is the poet trying to say about comfort through this porch? What is this poet trying to say about refuge and protection through this porch? Maybe, let me try to make a sentence. Lesson about life. Usually I like to start them with we, because then that gets to the human experience. We can take comfort, trying to use that idea that you came up with, in common imperfect things. That's totally true. I mean, think about the face of your grandmother or your grandfather or your uncle or your parents, right? Like they don't have perfect model faces, but you don't care because it's your grandma, it's your mom, it's your dad. There's more to it than that. And they might have a normal sort of face, right? There's not anything extraordinary about it, except it's extraordinary to you because of the comfort that you gain from those people in your life, right? And the looks that they give you to help you cope through life. So is it true for human beings that we can take comfort in common imperfect things? Yeah. Does that happen in the poem? Yeah. So I'm onto something here. I don't think that's it though. I mean, I think that there's more to it. I think in that way, maybe a period, through this, I hate doing this on the spot. The ordinary can become like holy or extraordinary. Don't you have that one stuffed animal or that one piece of clothing that reminds you of a person or a time or an event, right? And that thing might be completely like the eyes torn off of that stuffed animal, or the piece of clothing is frayed at the collar or whatever, but we don't care because it's got a significance beyond that that gives us comfort. That's the idea here, right? And so the porch is an example of that. So are there other poetic ideas or like themes that we could come up with? Sure, if we didn't come up with the word comfort, we could have gone in a different direction. There are multiple things to be learned from a poem. These are layered expressions like we've been talking about, right? So I'm not saying that when you do your analysis, you have to come up with the same thing that I came up with at the end. That would be a mind reading exercise. What you need to do in a 1, 2, 3 analysis is try to get to a good interpretation or meaning or idea from the poem. It might not be the only one, it probably isn't, but you need to get to something. Now, what if this was a thesis statement in an essay? What if I asked you to write an analysis essay on this poem? Well, this is the thesis, because if I say Ode to a Texas Porch by Esteban Rodriguez is about how we can take comfort in common imperfect things and how through that the ordinary can become extraordinary. Then the rest of my paper is about proving that, and I can go back to my notes to help me explain that. So that's why it's important to get to the theme, because otherwise you're just writing about random devices that are happening in the poem with no connection. Does that make sense? I know this is a lot, but I wanted to go through it in depth so that you could kind of see what's possible with a poem, and especially with the poem that you're going to do for your homework.